All right, here with Kevin Schofield, SCCinsight.com. Um, it was a big deal here. I saw an article that you put up on your website. It says state mandated court fines are sending black people into debt and to jail. SPD is making the problem worse. Tell us all about it.
Yeah. In fact, in some ways, this builds a lot on an article you talked about on the morning show about this lawsuit over suspended licenses. So, Seattle Municipal Court, is really trying to be a good progressive Seattle institution. They've been working hard on things like bail reform and probation reform, and something that they're looking at a lot right now is what's called, the fancy term is legal financial obligations, or LFOs, but really they're talking about, fines and fees and penalties. So when you get a traffic ticket, that fine you got to pay, and all the other penalties and things like fees that get stuck attached to it right there, right? It can be a lot of money, and particularly for somebody who can't afford to pay a ticket because they're living paycheck to paycheck. So they've been kind of looking into this and seeing, what's going on there, in particular racial disparities in what they're doing, and they've when they look at the output from the court system, from Seattle Municipal Court, they see there's definitely racial disparities there. When they look farther in, it looks like it's not really as much what's happening inside the court system as what's coming into the courts from police. So I sort of took that as, a challenge to go figure out, what's coming to the court system. And I went and asked the police department for all the data on their traffic tickets, both the criminal and non-criminal ones, because that's just a huge number. It's about, it's about 40,000 a year across like 2018, 2019. And what's surprising was, SPD actually doesn't have that data. For 8 years of consent decree, they've been looking at Terry stops, they've been looking at uses of force, they've been looking at all sorts of things, but they never looked at traffic citation data. At least from what they tell me, they've never looked at it. So I went back to the Seattle Municipal Court and I got their data on it. I sat down and I looked at it, and it turns out that there really is a bunch of pretty significant disparities in how Seattle police officers actually issue traffic tickets to people, both criminal and non-criminal. On the just non-criminal, traffic citations for, busted taillight or something like that, the numbers are pretty significant in terms of how many more of those go to, proportionally go to black people than to white people. So, just in context, black people are about 7 to 7.5% of the overall population in Seattle, and they get 37% of the tickets for busted taillight. They get 30% of the tickets for busted headlamp. 22% of the tickets for not wearing your seatbelt go to black people, right? So that's part of the problem coming into the court system is that there are just these clear racial disparities in what happens there. And it's a huge problem that they're not looking at this, right? The way in the consent decree they've been looking at all these other things. So that's a start of the problem. Then what happens when the stuff gets into the court system is that for white people, 50% of the time they just pay the ticket, but it's less than a quarter of the time for people of color. And in fact, when you look at sort of tickets that are defaulted on, when people just don't pay them, they don't show up to court and they don't pay them, you see pretty much the opposite. It's a very small percentage for white people, but it's 36% of the tickets that black people get. In 2018 and 2019, they defaulted on. And that's a problem because when you default on a ticket, they automatically revoke, they suspend your driver's license, right? So then that's just, not only is that cruel to people who can't afford to pay a ticket, because a huge number of those defaulted tickets are from people who just can't afford to pay the ticket, right? So now that's cruel to them. You've made it harder on them. And from a public policy perspective, it's just a terrible policy because now you've made it harder for this set of people to actually earn a living and pay their bills and, be upstanding members of the community and pay their fine. But you've also, if you have a suspended license, that means you can't get car insurance. So there are more people on the roads who are driving without car insurance. They're driving uninsured. So just from a public policy perspective, this and judges don't have any kind of discretion over this. They, the state law says if you default on a traffic ticket, they have to suspend your license on that, right? So then what you see coming out of that is that the sort of racial disparities for citations for driving and suspended license, which is actually a criminal citation, is even worse. 48% in 2018 and 2019 of the citations for driving and suspended license went to Black people, right? So almost half of them went to Black people, right? And again, a lot of that is people who got into that situation because they couldn't afford to pay the ticket, right? And we're just making it much, much worse. So, we're looking at, the way the system is designed, it really punishes you for being poor, being a person of color. You are more likely to get pulled into the system. You're more likely to get a ticket. You're more likely to not be able to pay that ticket. And then things just sort of cycle down from there, and it gets worse and worse.
Right. And what are some of the other things that the data you're able to extrapolate from all this big data mining that you did?
Oh yeah, it's like Christmas morning when somebody gives me a data set. So when I got this, data set from Seattle Municipal Court, first of all, and they worked with the Seattle Office of Civil Rights to get a couple of academic professors to do a whole set of research on this, and they found all sorts of interesting things. But when I sort of looked at the SPD citations, you can see very clearly, and you can see it on this graph right here, across a whole wide variety of different kinds of citations. Everything from negligent driving to I was talking about busted headlights and busted taillights. You can see the black line down at the bottom. That's 7.4%. That's the Black population in Seattle, and the pink line up at the top is 66.5%. That's the white population, right? So every black bar there that's above the black line is a place, where Black people get, disproportionately numbers of tickets, and every pink line there that's below, every pink bar that's below the pink line is a case where the system is too easy on white people. Right, that they're disproportionately, not getting ticketed for things. So you can see there's these very clear racial disparities that come across from this, right? So then, and so that's the kind of thing that the UW and Rutgers professors who were looking this up when they got into the data for what's happening within municipal court, they saw that actually. The judges are pretty even. Wherever possible, they really seem to be trying to reduce or eliminate fines or fees. In fact, 2 weeks ago, they made a big press release saying that they were trying to eliminate, basically they decided that whenever judges have discretion to eliminate fees, they're going to eliminate those fees. So there's a problem still that we have these state laws that make a bunch of these fees and fines mandatory, and the judges don't have any discretion over that. But for the ones that they can, they're going to reduce. And Seattle Municipal Court also has a very liberal policy in terms of allowing you to have a payment plan, right? So you can, if you can't afford to pay a ticket, you can get an installment plan and pay it over time instead, which is good. But for the folks who are can't pay it, and they end up defaulting on it, there's this graph that you had up there just a second ago, Omari. Yeah, that one that shows that, when you look at, in the court system, the cases where the judges sort of what they call dismiss with prejudice, they just outright, case dismiss this ticket. It's pretty even across, racial boundaries. When they actually are, entering findings and say, yeah, okay, you're guilty of this thing, it's pretty close to even, and sort of the discrepancy there with sort of the white, you could say just simply because they just more often than not, well, in fact, literally over half the time, they just pay the ticket. But you can see very clearly that Black and Indigenous persons default at a much, much higher rate than than white or Asian Pacific Islanders in the city. So there's just this big discrepancy in what happens with these tickets, and a lot of it can really be ascribed to, who can afford to pay tickets and who can not afford to pay tickets. And that's, that there's a great New York Times article back in June. And Omari, I know that you're really familiar with these stories and this data as well. That there's just this huge racial pay gap in this country. That means that black males get paid 51 cents on the dollar compared to white males, and that leads into the situation. So then they can't pay these tickets, they default, and that's not everybody. I don't want to say every black person does that. Clearly that's not true, but in the cases of people who can't pay a ticket and default on it, they get their license suspended. And then we see, like this chart you were just showing, half of the citations that come after that for driving a suspended license are black people. 629 across 2018 and 2019. That's not only a larger by proportion than white folks, but it's just a larger number of them. There were less than 500 driving with suspended license tickets given out to white people over those 2 years, right? So it's just, you can see this pipeline that happens to folks where if they can't pay a ticket, they get stuck in the system, and the outcomes just get worse and worse. They pile up the fines, they pile up more and more debt, they get their license suspended, so they have even a harder time paying that debt, and let alone putting food on the table and paying their rent. And from a public policy perspective, this is just a terrible outcome, right? So there's this lawsuit that you talked about on the morning show last week, where some people are suing the state, and they're saying that the state law, which says that it's mandatory that if you default on a traffic ticket, they're going to suspend your license, that's unconstitutional, because the Constitution requires that judges actually look at whether somebody has an ability to pay before they impose sanctions for not paying a ticket.
Right. And now through all of this data mining that you did here, and good job actually compiling all this information. I mean, are there any recommendations that you've seen out there? Is there anybody working around this policy, or does it just ultimately come down to the officer on the street and their discretion?
Yeah, so I think there are a bunch of recommendations that come out of for things that need to happen. One is clearly SPD needs to treat traffic citations the same way they treat Terry stops. And in fact, you could argue, looking at this data, it really strongly suggests that a lot of those, traffic stops are really Terry stops in disguise. They're police officers pulling over, a person of color because they suspect there's something else going on with them, right? And that's how you end up with more, at least in part of how you end up with more driving with a license suspended citations, because you don't get pulled over for driving the suspended license. You get pulled over for something else. So, and we see from this data that black people are pulled over for more of all those other things as well, right? So SPD needs to treat this area the same way they treat Terry stops, and look super hard at it, start doing training and more analysis to figure out what they can do so that police officers stop doing more traffic tickets proportionally for people of color, for the BIPOC community, than they do for the white community. Second thing is, there are some changes to state law that need to happen out of this, right? One is these mandatory fines, they need to change, and maybe that'll come out of the lawsuit, right? And at the very least, give judges more discretion, right? So if the judge sees that somebody doesn't have the ability to pay, then they don't have to impose these mandatory fees and fines on them, right? And then the other big change is so that they stop making it mandatory to suspend somebody's license if they can't pay a traffic ticket, right? And at the very least do that for people who don't have the ability to pay, right? If somebody has the ability to pay a ticket and they just won't, right, for whatever reason, I got less sympathy for them, right? For the people who can't pay, who just can't afford to do it, right? Taking away the driver's license is the worst thing you can do. It just makes the situation entirely worse for them, and it's just cruel, and we shouldn't be doing that. And then the last thing, and I talked about it a minute ago, is we need to close the racial pay gap, right? It's important to ask here, why is it that the BIPOC community, more often than not, or certainly more often than white people, can't afford to pay these tickets? Well, it's because they're paid less, right? So, part of addressing this problem that we're seeing and this pipeline that we're seeing in the criminal justice system that starts with traffic tickets is making sure that we close the racial pay gap.
All right, Kevin Schofield, as usual, man, lots of answers out there. Appreciate all your research into this.
Yeah. So,
And,
Omari, I was going to say, tell me what you think about this, right? Because, you grew up here in Seattle, dealing with cops, getting pulled over. Tell me what you see in this.
let me tell you, man, what I see in this is probably the same thing that's been there since I was a teenager and was getting pulled over just because. So for me, if I'm not like jumping up and down or anything, it's probably just because, man, it's something that people in our community already know. I mean, the best thing is that like you've just broken it down in a numerical sense, and numbers are much harder to push back on than people who are just like, I'm getting pulled over for no reason. But it comes down to like officer discretion, and it's funny because I played a clip from the debate with Cope and Inslee the other day, and Cope said something that I think resonates with a good number of the population in our state, especially a lot of white people. He said, "Hey, you already know it's the officer's discretion whether they want to arrest you, whether they want to find you, whether they want to ticket you, and everything else." And that's because Cope and a lot of other people have been the beneficiary of discretion. There's a lot of communities here that haven't been a beneficiary of discretion, and it's always a ticket, or it's always a fine, or it's always an arrest. And Cope being a police chief, although it's a small force over there where he's at, I mean, that speaks volumes, especially when he's running for governor, as the fact that he himself has been a beneficiary of discretion and is probably given discretion. And so, discretion is what's oftentimes absent in our community, and it very well might play its way out in the disproportion of tickets that are coming in there to municipal court.
I think it's almost, it's clearly obvious, at least to me, looking at this, that that's what's going on, right? That there is abuse of discretion here, right? And it's not it's not handed out evenly by police officers. And there are probably a bunch of people who can be pissed off at me for saying that. But I've spent 2 weeks staring at these numbers, and it's just glaringly obvious that, again, very similar to what we see with through the consent decree. The police departments look really closely at Terry stops. They've looked very closely at use of force. And the good news is both of those, the number of Terry stops at police department, over the last 8 years has gone way down. The use of force overall by police officers has gone way down. But what remains for both of them still has very clear racial disparities, right?
Well, I remember being in high school, and I remember my brother's car parked there on Cherry Street in between 24th and 25th. And the police officers at the time, gang unit was on the street. My brother wasn't in a gang, but went over there, and the officer was very clear, kind of like saying that he was in charge. He was like, I can articulate with my pen that your car is parked more than 12 inches from the curb, which I believe made it illegally parked, because it was too far from the curb. And that's what we call in the neighborhood, you get pencil whipped. You see what I'm saying? You get whipped by the pencil. You get whipped by the pen. Because, you these days, there's a camera phone. If there was a camera phone all those days, you could take a picture and be like, look, Your Honor, clearly it wasn't whatever. But imagine how many people, just because they're able to write in with the pen what it is, it's indefensible. Maybe you go to court, you pay the fine. If you can afford it, maybe you don't. You don't, your license is suspended. So it's like your numbers are saying something that we have already known and lived through for decades.
Yeah, and there's lots of attention paid on the incarceration system, right? And that part of the criminal justice system, where once people get into the jail system, they tend to cycle sort of back around, right? At that level, there's lots of attention. There's been lots of focus on this, but there's just way less focus on this part, right? And yet it's just as devious, right? Where you start with a traffic ticket, and if you can't pay it, you get into the system, your debt just goes up and up and up. You lose your driver's license, and then your debt just goes up and up, and you get deeper and deeper. Eventually, you're getting a criminal record out of this, and then everything just gets worse and worse. So this is, while there's not as much attention on this part of it, the whole, it starts with the traffic ticket part of it is just as insidious as the incarceral part of it that there's much more attention on.
Right on. Kevin, thank you. You said 2 weeks staring at these numbers, man.
Oh my God.
Hey, I appreciate you putting the time and effort into this, and we're going to stay on top of this and stay on top of this ACLU lawsuit and see where that goes.
All right. Thanks, so.